Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are tuning in from. This is The Awesome Journey, and I am your host, Kelly Steinicke, along with my co host in care, Christy Howard. And we're just two girls that connected on LinkedIn 15 years ago, live on opposite sides of the country, have giving hearts, a passion for paying forward, and I may have prayed to be living louder in my purpose. And now here we sit in front of microphones, bringing you the awesome journey. And as many of you know, our goal here is to highlight incredible individuals to share their unique stories and challenges, because we all need to be reminded sometimes that we are all united in our personal journeys. And one of the components that was always important to Christy and I to start with, but has been something that continues to come up, is men's mental health. And, women's mental health is much more of a regular conversation, more accepted conversation, doesn't necessarily have the stigma behind it. And we want to change that. So we're super blessed to have with us today Graham Gosselin, who is an IT recruiter. And he is a unique guest because we will have him back in a few weeks from a recruiter perspective to talk to job seekers and give advice in that. But today we are going to be talking about Graham's personal journey through his mental health struggles and depression, which we think is just so important to share, because we know there's many of you that will be able to connect with this, relate to it, and get the feeling of, man, I'm not alone, because we are not alone. And before we get started, because we want to have as much time with Graham as possible today, I will turn it over to my co-host in care, Christy Howard.
Hello. I love talking about mental health. I dance with my skeletons, and I think, everybody should dance with their skeletons and not be in the fear of not sharing your story. This isn't an awesome journey. We're on this side of the earth, and it is the good, the bad, and truly crappy. And so when we realize we've got what those struggles are, and we see those darkness, I call it the black rabbit hole. It's amazing to see how people have evolved through those struggles, and also sometimes realize that their struggles were brought into their life to be able to help other people, and share their story instead of feeling like it was a stigma, because it's not a stigma. Mental health, we need to continue to talk about it. And then men's mental health is very passionate to me for the fact that I've seen so many men that have just struggled. You're not supposed to talk. You're not supposed to say anything. You're just get over it. And that's not true. We're all supposed to be very vulnerable and understand where we're going from. So Graham, it's your time. It's your story. Please share with us. And as Kelly said, we will be having him back on. He had just two great stories, journeys, and, learning about the recruiting, but let's go into the mental health, because that's what's very important these days.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Absolutely. I'm happy to be here. Depression rocked my world. It came out of nowhere, but it also didn't come out of nowhere. I'll try and be succinct as possible, just kind of take you through the timeline or the story. But so December of 2018, that's my senior year of college. Been dating a girl for 4 years. We break up. She quickly starts dating the ex, or the person I wasn't supposed to worry about. Spring 2019, graduated from college. I said goodbye to my teammates because I played golf there. And those relationships are like some of the closest relationships you have, or that I had at that point. Said goodbye to golf. My grandpa was dying at the time. I moved in with my parents, and part of the retiring from golf, I just realized that I went from spending probably 40 hours a week outside to maybe 10. So there was a huge lifestyle change there. Winter 2019, a few months after all that, my grandpa died, which was the first experience of death for me. I moved in with my grandma to kind of help her in moving on. It was one of my grandpa's dying wishes that she wouldn't be alone. I became an uncle. And at that time, I kind of started realizing that I was actually getting depressed. And I was also working a job where I was supposed to be there at 7:30 a.m. and, leave at 6 or 7 p.m. Then February 2020, you think I'm going to say COVID, which, yes, that's a thing. But before COVID, I was sent to the hospital for this reaction I had to Tamiflu. And essentially, I mean, to keep things short, it was none of the doctors there had seen the reaction before. So I was doing all of the, the MRI, the spinal tap, the EKG, all of the things to like see what was going on. My third day, the neurologist comes in there and says, "You've either gone psychotic or it's this rare reaction to Tamiflu that we haven't seen." So he started treating it based on that, based on some literature he had seen. And I quickly started, turning a corner, and a couple days later, I was home. But then it didn't help that, like all of this happened, and then the world shuts down. COVID happens. So I was already like getting pretty depressed, and then the Tamiflu stuff, and COVID. And at that time, like spring 2020, like a month or two after the Tamiflu stuff and COVID, like I was very suicidal. Yeah, like I was making plans on what medicines in the medicine cabinet or whatever we had at home that might work. And luckily, like my mom found me in a pretty hard time. If she wouldn't have kind of like came downstairs or came home, I can't remember if she was upstairs or if she had walked in the door, but whatever it was, if she wouldn't have came downstairs or came in the door at that time, like it could have been a much different picture. So she realized I needed a lot of help. I started going to therapy, started taking antidepressants, and that was kind of like the first two things that I did to maybe start fighting a little bit. And then maybe a month or so later, I started just like getting a little more active. I think there was a time in my depression where I was, like very suicidal, as we were talking about, where I just had the realization that if like I was going to feel this bad, I'm going to feel this bad if I'm in bed or if I'm like outside or with friends or whatnot. So I just decided I was going to start doing things. So I started playing tennis. I started reading a lot more, taking walks with my dog, limiting screen time, that type of stuff. And then summer 2020, so probably like 6 months into the depression now, I was kind of dragged to church by my brother. And that, I mean, at first it was certainly more of like, I just need community, and that it still is the thing. Like that, I had always been around like teammates, had close relationships with family, but this was very different, where it was like they're choosing me despite, my flaws, despite whatever I'm struggling with. So, I think that was really the change that came to me, was just like, if I'm going to be this depressed, then I might as well start doing something, like act as if I'm not depressed. And I do think like those actions, like me kind of fighting back and embracing that kind of led me out of it in a way. And, I'm lucky. Like I said, my mom found me, and my parents were both therapists. Like I'm around people who can help. And a lot of people aren't that lucky. So,
Jeff has a question. And this is really tough, especially with job seekers. He wants to know if it was difficult. Was it difficult for you to admit that I need help? And, you know, as you mentioned, your parents are therapists. So your mom walking in realized something wasn't right. So, you know, she was trained. I don't know what kind of therapist she was, but she was just like, here's a path to go. However, most people don't have people in their life to really understand and see these signs. So how would you, you know, and for your brother, and he's a therapist too, right?
Right.
Yeah. Everybody in your family is a therapist.
Pretty much. Yeah.
You know, to say, hey, let's go to church, you know, let's
get you out.
You needed to get out, and you started doing that. But I'm wondering, is because you had left college, the girlfriend, you know, started dating the guy that you weren't supposed to worry about. You left all your guy friends, you know, playing, you know, golf and everything. So you missed that, that group feeling that you were, you know, you were alone. You were, and plus, I mean, COVID, we were all pretty much alone. I mean, it sucked well, for me, you know, I liked being alone, but anyway, that's just me. So, but to understand, how would you suggest somebody who's, because you've gone through it, suggest how they, especially a male, to say, hey, I need help, without worrying about somebody else's reaction? Because a lot of times when we say we need help, we sort of have an expectation of what they're going to say, and they don't usually say what we want them to say because they don't know what to say.
Yeah. You know, that's hard. And like I said, I was lucky to have those people around me. But,
and I think, you know, just to kind of even clarify on those things, you know, when just having one life altering situation, or, you know, trauma, however you want to categorize this, which you had the loss of a relationship, the loss of a loved one, the loss of community, and leaving behind a sport, you know, playing that's a big deal. All three of those things independently are significant and definitely require some sort of, you know, grieving process, if you will, and all of those together. And I think even what you said that really stood out in hearing it this time too for me was the changing from being outside 40 hours a week to maybe that you were only outside 10. And how even that, you know, compounded all of these issues. And then, of course, take away COVID. I mean, that was just, I mean, kick me in the face while I'm down situation, right? And I think it's also significant to say being around counselors, which, of course, not many of us are. But I would also think that that would add even a different layer for you in the sense of, how do I reach out to counselors, because I don't want them to know what's going on, because most of the time we don't even know what's happening. So we're kind of like, I don't even know what to say. Were you noticing, and I'm sure retrospect, you can look back and be like, man, I was really feeling down. But that struggle of asking for help, and particularly again with counselors, I would think that would just be another layer of difficulty to be able to say, I don't want my family to know what's happening with me.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think there was certainly like maybe a little bit of a blindness on their side, just because, like, I don't know, it's like you're the parents, you don't think your child is going to be suicidal and planning on how they might be able to kill themselves. So I think maybe there was a little bit of blindness, and I do remember, I love my parents and I'm not putting any fault on them, but I do think there was like a little bit of that where it was just like maybe denial, or maybe like, you know, it had to get really, really bad to where, you know, I'm about to kill myself, versus like, you know, all of these changes and getting in therapy before I needed, like way before when I needed it, before I got to this real big moment. But I think, you know, yeah, like looking back, it was definitely certainly hard to open up. But I think one thing that really helped me now, that really like helps me looking back on it, is kind of the lie that we like, I guess it's this idea that if you have a vulnerability, any type of vulnerability, and you share it with nobody, then that's dangerous. If there's some sort of vulnerability in, in a company and no one says anything about it, then, there's no accountability. There's nothing to prevent a really, really bad thing. And we see it all the time. And it's the same thing with mental health. I think it's like, if you have this vulnerability, and you share it with nobody, like that's really dangerous. And it is the easy thing. Like, it is easier to not share it with anybody.
And most people do.
Yeah. But
most people don't.
But I think the wise thing and the strong thing, the harder thing, is to be like, actually, I do have this vulnerability. I am really struggling and I need help. Yeah. So I do think there is a distinction I want to make. I think there's a difference between asking for help, reaching out, asking for help. That's strong. That's something that is hard. But I do think as men, we maybe put on a mask and maybe like complain or just vent. Like, I think there's a difference between, no, this is it, I'm really struggling, I need help. There is a big difference between that and just complaining that life sucks. Because like Christy said, we're on this side, life sucks for everybody at times. So.
Well, I also think that also men tend to, as you said, they'll vent, they'll complain. They won't want to admit that they're having an issue.
Mm-hmm.
They will spiral all the way down and not understand what is going on, because they're the man. They're not supposed to be in this place. And to be able to say, hey, and I know it's hard to say, hey, I need help, because they're going to be like, I don't know what to do. Well, just being able to voice it, to say, hey, and I think we had somebody that made a great comment, that you said that, that to pretend that you were not depressed and start to fight back.
Yeah.
Now, that's a great way to do it, because it got you out. You started doing stuff.
Yeah.
And I call it that heavy blanket that we had talked about. It's just like you got that depression. It's a heavy blanket. You took off that heavy blanket, but it was still sort of like, who is it in Charlie Brown that carried around the blanket? Linus. You were like Linus. I don't have kids, but you were like, you're still like Linus, carrying around that blanket in case you need to have it over you.
But that was even just such a great step, right? Is knowing, hey, I'm going to feel like crap no matter where I am, so I might as well go do stuff. Like, even that in and of itself was a step in the right direction.
For sure. Yeah.
And then, of course, your brother taking you to church, of course, that was a great thing to get you involved in community and getting you focused around other people and to get you focused on yourself. Like, what a smart thing for him to do, because you were raised, I don't know, religious, but you were raised faith-based, but you really discovered your faith during this process. Is that right?
For sure. Yeah. I grew up in the church, but I was physically there. I wasn't emotionally there or mentally there. It was not my thing. I wouldn't be a Christian. I probably wouldn't be doing this right now without the depression, or without the Tamiflu stuff as well. I know, that's just my story, So.
And one of the things I wanted to go on with what Christy was saying, which I absolutely do love, the Linus analogy, Christy, that was a good visual. So many of us.
It amazes me sometimes the stuff that come out of my head.
But
it's that visual. I just have that visual.
But it works. But I think one of the other important things, and when we had Chris Fields on, and he was talking about his depression as a first responder, because again, men and a first responder, you're supposed to be the hero of others, not the hero of yourself, because you're not supposed to need one. But I remember him saying, which this will stay, he said several things that will stay with me forever. But one that really stood out, I know growing up, whenever I heard about suicide, or, you write your first report about suicide, and it was always, the the temporary solution or the permanent solution to a temporary problem was the tagline, and that it was always viewed as being selfish. And what Chris
Yeah.
said, which God, I just got chills from it too, is he said, but when you're in that state, we don't think we're being selfish. We think we're doing everybody a favor. And that is just gut wrenching, but so truthful, because people aren't thinking those things because they're being selfish. They do think they're a burden to everybody else in some way when we're struggling those things, which is part of what paralyzes us from being able to ask for help or to even know what to say sometimes, at all. Because you again, where we're talking about, retrospect is 2020, looking back and going, God, I really was starting to be depressed when this happened, and then it just compounded. But when we're in it, we don't even know what's happening. We just know that I'm not feeling myself, and I don't know why.
Mhm.
So anyways, I just thought that was an important point to re-bring up, because I do think the mindset when people hear, suicidal ideation, and then the Hare Brothers, who we're also going to be having on, which is a community of men that support each other. And all of them have shared their stories. Man, I watch some of their videos and I sob, because they'll be like, I was in my truck with my gun ready to do the thing, and I got a text message from my brother, and that changed something. Excuse me. But same like your mom showed up, and it was not the norm, whether it was she came home early, came downstairs and wasn't supposed to, or it wasn't the norm. But it's just fascinating how those things do happen, obviously the way they're supposed to, because you were not supposed to play that out in any way.
And how does that, Graham, and again, we don't, politics, religion, whatever, it's not our thing, but faith is very strong to Kelle and I.
Yeah.
And it's what's interesting that everybody's on when they come on the show, their faith is strong. But my question is, you obviously were struggling with depression before you even realized you were struggling with depression after you left college. Then you had the reaction to Tamiflu. Your body reacted the most funkiest way you could imagine. And then you just sort of, in a way, I don't want to use the word, from what I'm getting, spiraling down. Like some people just completely spiraled down. It was a slow spiral. Like it was just that blanket was getting heavier and heavier. And then your brother came in and said, well, your mom, but then your brother came in and said, hey, come with me.
Yeah.
Do you feel in your heart that there was a reason why all this happened to you?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, I mean,
because we're not put on this earth just to hang out and not do anything. We're supposed to be here to go through the shitty times.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're supposed to, I mean, life is suffering. If you're not suffering now, you'll be suffering soon. I hate to put it that way, but that's just life on this side of Earth, or on this side of eternity, really. But yeah, I mean, I think that 100% happened for a reason. Yeah, I mean, I kind of get chills like thinking about it. Yeah, I mean, the hospital very much was the place that I felt, and the depression, like that was the place that I felt my life was most hellish, but I also felt the presence of God as well. So yeah.
Wow. And I think, of course, so many things in there. And I like the explanation of, yes, I grew up in a family where we went to church, but I wasn't there emotionally, but now you are there emotionally, and connected. And, of course, this story does continue into a direction of, going to church and what that has changed for you and what's going on with life now, Graham.
Yeah, what you do, the fellowship of the men.
Yeah. I mean, I It's crazy. I have, like I have 15, 20, like really close, like in terms of men, I have 10 really close men in my life that I can say I'm really, really, really struggling right now. And they will reach out to me. They will rally around me. They will pray for me, whatever that looks like. And the same thing with, we have a co-ed group. So I'm obviously a little more closer to the men than I am the women, but I still have my family is much bigger than it was. That's for sure.
And who did you meet there?
Yeah. That's a big thing. No, that's a big thing. I did meet my wife in church. She's
also a therapist, right?
She's a therapist, and she grew up 10 minutes from where my mom grew up. So you very much like marry or whatever, mom or dad or whatever that saying is.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, when I was depressed, as anyone who's struggling would know, church was in a basement, and you just don't want to go, like, my brother's pitch was like, oh, it would be really good for you. But it was also like, it's in the basement of a church, and like, you don't know anybody there. But he did say there was a pretty girl there. But still, like, when you're that depressed, that doesn't really do anything. Like, I didn't have eyes for her at the time. Like, I could acknowledge that she was pretty, but you don't have the energy. You don't have the energy to pursue anybody. So that was one of the first signs of like me actually beating or like coming out of the depression was having eyes for her in that way, and starting to pursue her.
That's awesome.
So,
and I know we talked about this when we initially spoke about having you on the show, is that feeling too of having to have the conversation with your now wife when you started dating about where you were and what you were struggling with at the time, and how that conversation was for you to bring up, but of course, how much of a relief it had to be like, I'm just going to be myself, and this is where I'm at, and this is who I am.
Yeah. I just, it took, I really do think it took like breaking my ego down to where I basically almost killed myself, to where I realized like, I'm done putting on this mask. I'm done. Like, this is who I am. So yeah, I mean, very early on, like, I knew it was a big deal to be like asking a girl out from church versus like meeting somebody online. At least to me, that felt different. So it was a little more intentional, and like on the front end, she did know a good bit about me, like that what my story was, but not anywhere near to the detail. So I just let her, like, it was scary to know that this person I was falling in love with, that I was about to tell her, like, hey, by the way, here's everything, like, here are all the bones in my closet. But the most restoring thing, the best thing for me was she chose me anyways. Right. Like, and that's the same thing with my community. Like, they choose me anyways. So
that is so important, right? That line right there. They chose me anyways. And when we are vulnerable, and like, even you just saying that, it's like the Linus blanket fell off, right? Because when we do get to that place, it's a relief, because it's exhausting carrying around all of that crap that we picked up along the way, and that we think are things that people are going to judge us for. And let's be honest, if people do judge us for that, they're not people that we need in our lives anyways. But so beautiful how, and I do believe this, and I know Christy does, and I'm sure you do as well, Graham, how beautiful God played out this story for you. I mean, and again, in retrospect, it's almost even like the hospital was your time that God was saying, hey son, you need to lay down and take care of yourself because you're
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
be like, what a gift that was in hindsight. But of course, at the time, what a horrific situation. I mean, that had to be just terrifying. But to be able to now look back and be like, wow, that was a true gift. What a blessing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. Like, I still have, flashbacks or like PTSD of the experience. I was very, I was hallucinating. I don't think we talked about, but it was basically a schizophrenic break. So I didn't know who I was, didn't recognize my family, didn't know where I was, didn't know my name, couldn't speak. I was catatonic. So that was my experience in the hospital. But,
Wow.
it felt very hellish, like I talked about, but it also, like you said, like it was kind of God's wake up call in a way.
Wow.
Sometimes we have to burn to become the phoenix.
Oh, amen. And then, we say this a lot too, is, if growth were easy, we'd all be doing it. I think our biggest pivotal points in our lives where we grow the most are usually from the most painful, difficult, however you want to label experiences. They're not because things were great. Everything was rainbows and butterflies, and then they just got better. It is always through that, and I don't know whoever said this, but, life is about ups and downs, and that's the heartbeat. And when it stops, life stops. I certainly don't like the pitfalls, but I wouldn't change any of my pitfalls because you can look back, and when you're in them, I do not like them. I don't appreciate them. I actually get frustrated with them, but then have to remind myself, this too shall pass. I don't know the reason. And I know when I get to the other side, I'm going to have some serious questions, but accept them in the time and look back and go, you know what, that really was a blessing in my life. And I wouldn't change anything. And it is, and I important that you're able to share this story. Excuse me. And one of the things I think that's great that you do on LinkedIn, and this is a good little maybe transition into that because you haven't been on LinkedIn very long. You share your story and you're vulnerable in your posts. And so I do want to say at this time, people, if you're not following Graham, please do go check him out, not just for his recruiting, but just for his persos. Because you put the rawness and the realness in it, and that's helping people. And that is such a gift to the rest of us and such a blessing. So how did that kind of all come together? You getting back on LinkedIn for one, and then wanting to go that route with some of your posts?
Yeah. I mean, I started posting like more on LinkedIn probably like, I don't know the exact dates, probably about 5 or 6 months ago. But at first it was just like, getting myself out there and then like posting stuff for job seekers. But I actually met, it was my first face-to-face interaction with somebody on LinkedIn. He was also in Knoxville. His name's Jonathan Darling. We quickly hit it off. He's also a man of faith. And it was like, somebody I don't know personally at all, but, we spent an hour together. And I told him, I was like, I think I'm like, this has been put on my heart, but I don't like, I feel like, how is it going to be received? And he just looked at me and it was like, Graham, if it has the power to help one person, then it's your obligation. Like that is who we're supposed to be. So yeah, I mean, it's really hard it's certainly hard, and I can definitely see it on LinkedIn where I can post a dancing GIF of Snoop Dogg and it gets like 270 likes and comments and, blows up. And then I talk about depression and it's like 15 people, but I don't do it. Like I do it for the people who need to feel seen and who are like,
I think those are the silence. I think those are the silent scrollers.
Yeah.
I agree 100%.
Those are definitely the silent scrollers.
Yes. Because it is making a difference because people are afraid to say anything, especially, and those are the ones that we want to hear the message, right? Are the ones that are on the fray. because they need to hear it. Good. I'm glad. I was just going to say, bring Jeff's comment back up because I think this is a great question.
Yeah. So Jeff wants to know when you find yourself breaking down again, and we do.
Yes.
I mean, Kelly and I know our triggers, and you just can't get up for the day. What do you do? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's life.
Especially as a male.
Yeah. I mean, I let somebody know that I'm struggling, whether it's my wife or just sending a quick message in group meets of the guys I'm at church. Sometimes it's even my boss, like, hey, like, not giving them the full detail, but just like, hey, I'm kind of struggling, like, just letting you know. So I think like just somebody knowing that you're struggling is a big thing in that moment, in that very like specific time that you're struggling. That's important. But I think it's also just like goes back to what we were talking about earlier, but like there are going to be days that you don't want to do anything. There are going to be days that you want to stay in bed all day, that you want to like whatever. Like for me, I used to want to play PlayStation all the time and not see anybody, and like then take a nap and then play more PlayStation. But yeah, I think like maybe I don't want to say like disciplining yourself, but more just like just do the same thing every day. Like don't give yourself really the option of like, well, yeah, this day sucks, but like I'm still gonna go do what I'm doing regardless. And I don't want to say,
Well, and it goes back to, as you said, you were going out, you were taking a walk. I mean, some people like going to the gym. Just trying to get into that habit, or reading, listening to music. Just, I'm big, everybody knows, get out of your head. That's the most dangerous place that we can go.
I think there's a visual that I see pretty regularly where it's like people post about, it's like, if you want to do something, you just do it. But then it's like, well, what if you do it? Or what if you want to do something, but you're afraid? Then it's like, okay, well, you do it scared. And I think it's the same thing. Like, do it if you're sad, do it if you're depressed. It's not like putting on a mask. It's embracing that, like, I'm struggling right now, but still go do the things, like still make your bed, get out of bed,
Yes.
Go about your day. Yeah.
And even and I've said this on other shows as well, for myself, when, going through one of the worst times of my life, I had a checklist that my day was: get up, checkbox, get dressed, checkbox, go out. And then it was, smile at someone, smile at 3 people, and it increased. And as silly as that sounds, when you're at the depths of it all, those at least make you feel accomplished. And then of course it's like you were saying, Graham, is it structure, and it is giving some discipline. Go do it, because just like going to the gym, the more you go, the less painful it is. Well, the more that you get up and face the world, the less painful it gets. I would like to go back on when you say, when you're reaching out to someone, and I'm same. I know that I can, and Christy's heard it from me, that I can call and be like, I'm struggling. Is because I think it's important to, how do people respond when you say that? Hey, I'm struggling, even though you don't have to get into detail. You don't have to say, just because I think it's important for others to understand, like, it's not like people are going, man, what's the deal?
Like, again,
yes, like, yeah, that it's embraced, and how that feels for you now, having the confidence, or maybe that's even the wrong word, but feeling strong enough to be able to let people know how you feel, and how it's accepted. And maybe it is because how it is being accepted and handled, and it's not being judged.
Well, I can't control that. I can't control whether it's going to be accepted or whether it's going to be judged. What I can control is letting somebody know. And like we said, the more you do it, the more the less power it has, and the more of a habit it becomes. I will be the first to tell you that I have told people before, and they're like, depression is a choice, or like depression is like just a thing that happens. I'm like, no, it's, but
I like when they say, I've never been depressed.
yeah,
Really?
yeah.
We've all been
Or
depressed in one form
it's
or
a
the other.
myth. I'm like, really? There's 300 billion people, whatever. So many people who are struggling.
Right.
But yeah, I can't tell. Like at first, when you're first getting to know somebody, you don't know how they're gonna respond to things.
Right.
But the more you practice, you realize like, okay, this person responds well. This person like knows where I'm coming from. The hair brotherhood. I haven't Christy recently just kind of put me in touch. We haven't even really officially talked, but having community that like are going to respond well. So I think I really do think having the guys at church that were strangers for a little bit, but the more times that I called them and just said, hey, I'm struggling right now. And it was responded with like grace, or it was responded with, yeah, me too. Like not, just making me feel seen and making me feel like I'm not the only person. I think most of the time that's what happens is when you share with somebody, it's not like, I don't know, it's not like, oh, I'm exactly depressed. I had this exact same experience. It's more just like, I'm also struggling in this other thing. And struggling together is just way better than struggling alone. So.
Yeah. And even on that point, it's we can never compare a depression or how we respond to things because, I've had, a family tragedy, and there's losing my father when I was a teenager, and there was my mom, my brother, and we all three grieved and suffered completely different. But because I think people tend to want to be like, oh, well, I haven't gone through as much as you have, so I don't want to talk about my thing because it's not as big. Or my thing is so much bigger than what you've been through. You have no understanding. And it's like, don't compare because those things really don't matter. And I think, and again, to go back to one of the things that Chris Fields said that I think is just so important too, is when he finally reached out and, said, I need help, he was astonished at how many hands were reaching back. And when you do it, it's kind of that moment of like, man, why didn't I do this sooner? Or, wow, that wasn't as bad as I thought, because then it goes back to our head. Our head always makes a scenario way worse than it will ever be in a million years. And it tends to end up being such a relief. And Christy, I know I've been seeing a whole bunch of things pop up here in chat. Is there anything that you want?
Yeah. And I just got a message. And it's from a male, but he'd like to know more about how not to feel like a burden or a failure, and especially for somebody who's going through this job search. They don't have a job, and this is so hard for men. I mean, I deal with men and women daily, and it is so much harder for men looking for a job because they're supposed to be the caretaker, the breadwinner, the strength, all that stuff, and it's. I just see more men struggling mentally with this job search. Plus, and we'll get into that next time you come around, because we know how up and down that job search is. But how do you, besides this person going to the gym, getting into a structure and getting out of their head, how would you suggest this person to not only stop staring at the screen 24/7 looking for a job, how do they get to remember that they're not a failure and they're not a burden? What would you suggest?
I think it's just trying to believe that those are lies. That I know I know people like this. I have people in my inbox. I have relationships with people who think that they're a burden, who think that they're somehow a failure. But that's not the truth. Like, you're the good thing is humans are always failing, right? Like, everyone is failing together. It's not like, I mean, even the successful people, you think, like, you go spend a day with them and you realize how, like, messed up they might be, like, or we all have problems. Like, so I think, like, trying to find, the situation is unique to the person. And I think that's what feels isolating. So sometimes, in this case, the like, my story is situation, like, is unique to me, like what happened with the Tamiflu stuff, with all the stuff that we talked about. But the feelings I felt are felt by so many other human beings.
Yeah.
And I just don't, like, that's just a lie. I don't have some sort of, like, hey, do this and you won't feel like a burden anymore. Or you won't feel like a failure.
No,
Like, it doesn't go away.
and unfortunately, that's a tough thing, because
Right.
it's in their head. It's in our head.
Yeah.
We are our worst critic, our worst enemy. And when you're feeling that you're not being successful of getting an interview, doing whatever, and you're doing everything you can imagine,
Mm-hmm.
why give you kudos? Let's put you down.
Yeah.
Because that's where you're at. You don't have a job and you're a failure. I mean, that's sort of human reaction, to be able to turn it around and say, but no, I'm doing everything I possibly can. And I know what I bring to the table, and I'm successful. I have been successful. I've learned with meditation, and I just recently really drew myself into meditation. And I will, and Kelly knows this, like, the last few years, I've been carrying a lot of stress.
Yeah.
Now it's like, I do my meditation, I read the Bible, and I'm not one that reads the Bible because it's especially Old Testament. I get very confused. But I'm very relaxed now, because I've spent my whole life in those dark places. I had that Linus blanket, and I've seen my male friends and relatives be in that place. So I'm able to understand that they're not a failure.
Yeah.
And to be able to have, and if you're alone and you don't have anybody to say, hey, you're not a failure, you got 3 people right here.
Amen. Amen. And
we're not going to judge you.
No.
We're the last people to judge people, because we have felt that if we spoke, people are going to judge us.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the whole part of, to go back to the failure part, failure is that 4-letter word that's so horrible. And people are like, oh, I have a fear of failure. Failure is part of life. And it's about mindset of how we really look at that word. Because not everything is going to work all the time. So failure is part of the process. And knowing that that's just feedback. It's not, you're not doomed, and that's not going to define your life because of that one thing. I look back now on some of the things that I was so, embarrassed, humiliated, all the things of a failure in my life. And I look back at it now, and it's like, that was just part of it. And I'm who I am because of that. Like, that was part of my journey. And which is part of why we do say it's the awesome journey. Not everything seems great. And it is about the good, the bad, and the downright shitty, because it's not always great. But it is about reframing our thoughts on how we interpret the word failure. It's a stop.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to live there. And if you are feeling like you're living there, you need to talk to somebody. So I think that's an important thing too, as a takeaway. You're not going to live in that failure space. You're not defined by that. Reframe your mindset about it. And, to go to Christy's thing, and also to what you were saying just before, Graham, is when we do start telling ourselves all of these things, our brain continues to feed it in the most negative way. And being aware of that is so important. And that is when you need to, call that friend, reach out to someone and be like, man, I am in my head something fierce and I just need to get rattled for a minute. Or I know for me, I journal or I reach out to a friend and say, I'm struggling, I'm having a rough time. And man, I can't get out of that thing. And I do think with the job market the way it is now, even Brendan Gilbert, who we had on last week, and everybody needs to go watch that episode. It was incredible. He was struggling.
And he got a job.
Yes.
And he did get a job.
Um,
we've had
yes,
a lot of our job seekers that have been on the show have gotten
he
jobs.
just got a job too. But he ended up going to the doctor and getting on antidepressants as well, because he was like, I was the breadwinner. I was out of work for 8 months. I couldn't take care of my family. And he did not know how to process any of that. And so the more we've been having these conversations, because people aren't being out of work anymore for 4 to 6 weeks.
Yeah.
It's months
and months and
months,
years. And that does a huge impact on people's mental health, which is another reason Christy and I wanted to do this, is because everybody's going through something, whether it is about the job market, your personal lives and financial, because you were never supposed to be prepared to be out of work for a year. It always said, make sure that you have enough in your savings to, for a quarter, if anything were to happen. Your immediate saving. Well, people have depleted all of that and are now into other things and in debt. And how do I get out? And now I can't even get a job that's beneath me. And I say that experience wise, not beneath me as a level of any task is beneath me,
Sure.
But you know what I'm saying? So all of that being said, I guess I should probably toss it back over to you now, Graham, because Christy.
Well, Greg asks a question: how and what has your church done to addressing mental health? And to tie into that, you've mentioned that you share with your boss, look, I'm having a bad day.
Yeah.
How have you, that's huge when you're working and you don't want your boss to know that you're, having some issues and stuff like that.
Right.
This is old school. I remember being in that place.
Yeah.
I had a boss that, I don't know if you remember the Beanie Babies and there was a crab. My boss would put a crab on top of my cube when he knew that I was just in a rotten mood because I was going through some personal stuff. And he's like, oh, put the crab up there. Everybody leave Christy alone. But nobody ever would say, Christy, what's wrong?
Right.
So for now, and again, I'm going back old school, to explain to how your church addresses it, but also how, it was to share with the company you work with.
Yeah. I think when the first time I went to church, and when I say church, a lot of people think like Sunday service, like, the production, the sermon, whatever. I'm talking more about like small group. Without small group, I don't think I would be a Christian. So the first time I went to small group in the basement of my church, they talked about the sermon or whatnot, and we did like a little intro, but then we split up into guys and girls. And at that time it was like 5 guys, and the leader looked at me and was just like, I just want you to know that this is a safe space for anything that you're struggling with. And he just looked at me and he said, for instance, like, I have been addicted, like I struggle with addiction, and I'm not going to go ahead and say like what the addiction is, but he has struggled with an addiction for a very, 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 very long time. And then the other guys, all said like something else they're struggling with. And I'm like, what are y'all doing? Like, this is not what you're supposed to tell people. Like, this is not what you tell a stranger. So I went like, it's not necessarily something that my church has done, or like, it's not like, a sermon I heard or, that. It's more of just like the community and having this space where I have, like, at that time it was 4 other men, but now it's 10 who I can be real with, and I don't have to wear a mask. And that got easier, like, once I started working at my current job, like that kind of coincided with a lot of this this timeline. But as it got easier to talk to these other guys, I realized it wasn't that hard to just tell my boss, like, everyone has had hard times. So I'm just like, hey, today's kind of hard, just letting you know. And she does the same with me, to be honest. She lets me know if,
which I think
Love that.
it embraces you as a recruiter, because as a recruiter dealing with job seekers, you have empathy.
mm-hmm.
And even though you have that JD you need to get through and make the money and everything and get the job done, you still have the empathy of what somebody's struggling with.
Yeah.
Over, I'm just going to interview you, have these stupid questions that we sometimes ask or usually ask, and then just move on and not have the empathy for why we just had this conversation and I'm never going to talk to you again. Yeah, you're not going to probably talk to them, but you're going to understand their struggle and go forward. That's the way of getting to know probably why you're a good recruiter. Well, we'll find that out in a few weeks.
We'll see.
Giving you a lot of pressure.
Yeah. And I guess now we're coming here on our to wrap up. So I do want to hand it back over to you, Graham, for any last thoughts that you have or takeaways that you would like to wrap up for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it still goes back to the thing of, vulnerability shared with nobody is dangerous to you. It can be dangerous to others. It is not it's going back to the fill your own cup too. It is strong. It is a strong thing to fill up your own cup so you can better serve others, instead of spending yourself before, before you get there. And then, I really like the awesome journey. I like but to me, it seems like y'all focus a lot more on the process. You've talked the ups and downs, and I think it's the same thing for anyone who's struggling, or anyone who feels like they're a failure or a burden. Like, you were defining that based on what society might say, or what, this outcome, like, I don't have a job yet, or I don't have such thing yet. But if you focus on the process of getting out of bed, of going to the gym, of maybe doing some meditation like y'all talked about, that's progress. Master the process, and that's you get to define what success looks like. Don't give that to the world.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's also one step at a time.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Christy, do you have any final thoughts, my dear?
Well, I think I've shared this, but I don't know how I can do this. It's upside down. My tattoo. That's weird. So it's a cross. It's the heartbeat, and it's a heart. And so I had never wanted to have a tattoo, and I got that for my 60th. It's because I realized my life, my faith, my heart, my life, it's ebb and flow. And, I've shared many times, and those who know me, I totally dance with my skeletons. You're going to have one step at a time, but you'll have some steps backwards, and you'll fall back in bed, and you'll get that. But knowing that the more you keep on going forward, it's like the cha-cha. Now I guess you guys have the visual of the cha-cha. You're gonna continue to go, and then realize that, oh my gosh, look how much I grew within myself through all this struggle. Yeah. And now I can help somebody else.
Yes.
Because as you mentioned, being quiet doesn't help you, and it doesn't help others.
Yeah.
And I feel that many of us have gone through these struggles, especially men now, sharing their story because they weren't allowed to share their story before.
Right.
And as Chris has mentioned, he had mentioned on the show, is breaking that, stigma.
Right. So right. Do you want to, before I do a final wrap, do you want to talk about our guest next week?
No.
Okay. Watch the post
You'll have to wait for the
because it's
posts. You'll have to see. I had
always
thought
good.
about maybe putting a list because we're booked out until
I
October.
know,
Putting
which
a
is
list, and so
great.
people. But no, you guys have to follow our
That's right. Go
our
ring our
business pages,
bells.
ring our bells, and all of our guests are very
Yes,
unique and very
so
diverse.
important.
We just pull them out, and it's we do. I have noticed we do tend to focus on the men,
But you know what?
not
It's all
well, because the vets and
yeah,
stuff like that, and but we're all about for everybody,
yeah.
and it goes back to we're wanting people to share their story.
Because it helps someone, and likely more than a one, quite honestly. And as we do wrap up today, do watch for our post for next week's guest. Graham, we cannot thank you enough for being here today, sharing your story, and being so vulnerable. It's helped, I guarantee you, more than one person. It's an incredible story and a journey, and it's just been a privilege to be able to have you share it with us and our audience. So, everyone, if you're listening, we thank you for joining us today. Please do reach out to the three of us, ring our bells. If you don't want to comment on something, you can message us privately. Always remember that you are not alone ever. Um, and do also remember that we are all on this journey together, and together we do make it. Have a great day, and we'll see you next Tuesday at 1:11.